Welcome to episode 35 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. Today, our topic of focus is the excellent topic of nasal breathing or breathing through the nose. So, we all know that we have a nose and we have a mouth, and we can breathe through the nose and we can also breathe through the mouth. So, we have some questions about the nose and the mouth. And is breathing through one of these orifices better inherently than the other? We tend to hear a lot of conversations and claims out there that nasal breathing is optimal and important and healthier for the body than mouth breathing or oral breathing. And so that is what we wanted to take a look at today in this episode. So the claims are widespread, and our question is, are these claims evidence based? And, after a pretty thorough look into this topic and some of the research on this topic, it's become clear to us that it's not a simple black or white issue. Like as with just about all of the topics that Travis and I tend to discuss on the podcast, there tend to be like big, bold claims about things. And we kind of want to be black or white about things, but as with all those other things, this nasal versus oral breathing topic is probably not so black or white. And we'll kind of dive into the nuances and the intricacies of that as we talk and go through this material today. But with all of that said, obviously taking time to focus on this breath-based topic is super relevant for us as a yoga community, because we all know that the breath is so central to so much of what we do on the yoga mat. Within yoga, we have pranayama, which basically means breath or life force control. And clearly, pranayama is an integral part of a yoga practice. So when we're practicing yoga, we're often ujjayi breathing, which is a type of breath that we do on the mat, that we often do. And it's through the nose. And we tend to do ujjayi breath like kind of all throughout a yoga practice. And that is a form of pranayama or breath control. But then we also, within a yoga context, have kind of specific pranayama exercises that may be a part of our yoga practice, things like alternate nostril breathing or more focused, like we are doing this breathing technique right now. So because of that major role that the breath plays in a yoga practice, we think that this nasal breathing topic is like extra relevant for our community, but it's also just super fascinating when you really look into it. And it is certainly relevant for just anyone with a body. I would definitely suggest that. And also BKS Iyengar, who is one of the fathers of modern postural yoga. He would famously say that the nose is for breathing and the mouth is for eating. And I think that's kind of a funny phrase, but Iyengar would definitely talk about that. So our plan is just to take a little deeper look into some of these claims that we have on our hands. And while it's just inherently interesting and valuable and rewarding to learn more about this topic of respiration and taking breath in and out, we also think, as usual, that just taking the time to just kind of look a little deeper or examine some of the claims that we tend to hear or the beliefs that we might have about things can be, just in general, regardless of what the topic is, can be helpful for just improving our scientific thinking skills. And so that's just another reason why we wanted to take a look at this today. So just anytime that we question things that we maybe tend to believe or assume or hear out there, we may choose to change our mind about certain aspects, but we also may just choose to continue to believe them because upon examination, it seems like this is actually really rooted in reliable science. And so regardless of like the outcome, the process of that questioning can be super good for us in our like scientifically thinking minds. So our plan for the episode today, just so we know kind of what it's going to look like, is we want to start off by talking about nasal breathing within the context of like a yoga or a mindfulness practice. So nasal breathing in that context. And then we want to turn our focus to talking about nasal breathing more on your day-to-day level, or the idea of like nasal breathing for optimal health, and that the claims that nasal breathing is better than mouth breathing and things like that. So we will shift our focus to that. And then at the end of the episode, we're really excited because we're bringing in a special guest, and she's a science educator with her PhD in immunology, and she's a yoga teacher. And her name is Rachel David. We're super excited to introduce you to her. So she's going to come in, and we will have an interview with her about a popular book that I'm pretty sure many people in our audience will have heard of. And this book is called Breath by James Nestor. And yeah, it's a really popular book in general, but also in the yoga world, very widely read. And we wanted to get Rachel's take on it as a science educator. So she's going to talk to us about that. And in addition to the book Breath, there's another popular book out there that came out before Breath, that's called The Oxygen Advantage. And that book is by an author named Patrick McKeown. And Travis and I, we're going to talk a bit about that, and also about a breathing method that many of our listeners may have heard of, called the Buteyko Breathing Method. It tends to have a presence like in some circles of the yoga world. It's also just kind of popular in general, the Buteyko breathing method. And just in case you may have heard of it but not known its name or remembered its name, but the Buteyko breathing method tends to advocate things like we all tend to chronically overbreathe or hyperventilate. These are kind of some of the claims of Buteyko. And that is like a root cause of many health problems that we experience. And so we address that and treat those problems by breathing less, taking like shallower breaths, slowing our breath, and breathing through our nose. And also practices like mouth taping, like taping the mouth at night. So just to say that those are some of the points that come along with Buteyko. And so maybe you have heard of it, even if it didn't ring a bell when you heard that method, that name. So basically, we plan to talk about the popular books and the Buteyko method, kind of toward maybe the second half-ish of this episode. So that is everything we're planning to tackle today. And before we dive into our content, just a reminder about some ways that you can support our work with this podcast. You can, of course, subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating or a review. Another great way to support us is by subscribing to my email newsletter, which will keep you up to date on all of our offerings. And you can do that at jennirawlings.com/newsletter. The link is in the show notes. And a final way you could consider supporting us is joining Travis's and my Strength for Yoga remote group training program, which is this really awesome, one-of-a-kind monthly strength training program that we designed for yogis. You can use code podcast30 for 30% off your first month in our program. And you can find more at jennirawlings.com, and the link is in the show notes. So, with all of that said, Travis, I'm so glad to have you here with me today to talk about this obviously kind of big and weighty and nuanced topic. I'm wondering, like, what sorts of things have you heard just kind of out there in the ethers about nasal breathing?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for doing such a thorough introduction.
You're
I think you
welcome.
covered everything. And I
Did I?
think
Okay, good.
uh, it's funny because we usually put the links to the show notes, or the link in the show notes, to important things, but I think we're probably not going to link those books. Would you
Oh, we're
agree?
not going
Would
to
you
link. Wait,
agree with that?
why are
Well,
we not going to link them?
we're not advocating necessarily for the books, right? There, if people have
Travis,
happened to stumble across them so far, and then
I see
be
what you're
that as it
saying.
may,
Or if people are interested, of course, they're very easily findable.
they can find them. Yeah. But anyway, yeah. So I've heard of these books for sure, and
Yeah,
then just people talking, whether they're talking about the books or just talking about the concepts
right,
outside of
right,
the
right, right.
books. And
Yeah,
yeah, nasal breathing is like all the rage these days, and mouth breathing will kill you, right? Maybe not fast, but slowly. And
Right.
we should be taping our mouths shut and doing
Mm-hmm.
all those things, because apparently nasal breathing is that much better for you. That's what I hear. That's
Yeah, that's
not necessarily
definitely
going
what
to
I
be
hear
our
too.
conclusion, right?
Right. Well, and also I definitely don't think our conclusion is also going to be like that's completely wrong. That's 100%, right? Because
Right.
it's nuanced, right?
Right. So that's the fascinating thing about this topic, right? Is that the information that's in those books or in the research
Mm-hmm.
is does there is evidence
Mm-hmm.
supporting nasal breathing in, and like you said, it's nuanced. It depends what your
Mm-hmm.
objective is and what type of outcome you're interested in, whether it's some sort of short-term benefit or some of sort of long-term
Yeah.
benefit.
Yeah.
And the challenge is, well, what does the research show, and then what can we reasonably conclude from that? But to your point, like I said those things in jest, but there's certainly evidence supporting the benefits of nasal breathing, like full stop.
Right.
So
Right. Right. Right.
it's
And we're
not, I'm
yes.
not, yeah,
Like
totally,
yeah.
like you said, it's not to say that this is a whole bunch of BS, but rather that it's more, like you said, there's way more to it. And we
Yeah.
have to put on our critical thinking caps, because if we just read the books and listen to what some of the talking heads are saying, then
Yes.
we might not be getting the full story.
100%. And what you were saying was just making me think about, and I think this is such a common theme with basically everything that you and I tend to talk about, but like
Hmm.
the human body and our experiences in our bodies is super complex and multifactorial. And I mean, it could take a life of just studying the science of the body to like fully get to certain levels of comprehension. And so I find that what you and I tend to kind of combat quite a bit or question quite a bit is just when a lot of the black or white claims
Right.
and a lot of just oversimplifying, and also people not even realizing that they're oversimplifying because maybe some of that Dunning-Kruger effect that we've talked about before, like maybe
Hmm.
you learn a little bit about something, but then you think just because you think that you know everything about it, and therefore we can just it's easy to oversimplify things. So I feel like nasal breathing good, mouth breathing bad
Hmm.
is a
Hmm.
perfect example of this black or white thinking.
Green check mark, red
Green check.
X. But it was
Exactly.
funny when you introduced the topic, because it's like, well, you already know what our conclusion is going to be, because the conclusion is the same every time, which is that
Right.
it's not black or white. And so if that, I think most of our listeners, that's why they listen, right? But if that's boring
Yes.
to you to be like, well, I just want to know what the simple
Oh
answer
yeah.
is, and you never tell me the simple answer, then that's, yeah, we're like a broken record. But I think that's like the fun of the episodes, right? Or the
You're
podcast
so
is, well,
right.
let's dive into it.
Because the value, at least I feel like the value is in the inquiry and in everything that we learn just through examining these topics. And yeah, if we just went with like the black or white or green check mark, red X, there's not much learning to be had there, you know?
Hmm.
And so it's in this process, I feel like, of the investigation where there's just so much like richness there and also fascination there. So, I guess with that said, we also just kind of wanted to make it clear for this episode that, and we had another episode, Travis, that we did like this, which was our episode on interoception, where I had done a whole bunch, a pretty, I'd read a lot of the research on interoception and I'd put that together for a course on my website. And then we did an episode on it where you didn't really know, you hadn't looked that much into it, but I had looked a lot into it and I was kind of presenting information to you.
Hmm.
And that is also kind of what's going on with this episode today, where the
There are
plan
going to be
is.
two experts, and I'm not one of them.
Oh, because our other expert is Rachel David coming in at the end, and
Yes.
I'm not an expert, but
No, I use
I'm
that
someone
term
who,
somewhat in
yeah,
jest. Hopefully,
that's right.
Rachel David can be our true expert. But like you said, you've done a lot of preparation and reading into this,
Yeah,
and
I put
I
together a
have
lot for
done
this, so
less. So I'm
right,
going
but
to be
you.
learning along with the listeners.
Exactly. And so this episode, I hope it won't be so much, but it may consist of a little more of like me telling, I might be talking a little more, but we'll see. We'll see.
I'm excited
So
to learn.
yeah, yes, yes, I'm excited to just have this discussion. Uh, I guess one of the first things, and we've already touched on this a bit, but one of the first things that I wanted to lay out was that I think it's important that we realize that there is a distinction between a breathing practice or a breathing technique that is done,
Hmm.
for a temporary amount of time. It's done consciously. We're thinking about it. We're doing it in that moment. And that's a lot of what we tend to find, like in a yoga context, is maybe breathing
Right.
practices or techniques. So that is like one context in which we might talk or think about nasal versus oral breathing. And then it's a different context to talk about or think about day-to-day breathing and just
Hmm.
general your automatic breathing pattern, your unconscious breathing pattern all throughout your life, and the connection between that and something like optimal health.
Right.
Right? Does that
Because
make
it's
sense?
easy to
That
look at something and say, oh, and especially from a yoga lens, like we feel pretty good saying nasal breathing. The
Mm-hmm.
the breathing techniques that we use in yoga, which are all or mostly nasal breathing,
Mm-hmm.
we believe that those have benefits, and they do have
Yes.
benefits, which we'll talk
Yes.
about, right? And
Yeah.
then, but it's a big step, too big of a step, I think, to say, well, because of that, nasal breathing's better always,
Yes.
all the
Just
time,
always.
and for
Yep.
our overall health, because
100.
it's a different question.
Exactly. But I think that you can see what I can see, which is that I feel like the two kind of get melded together. Like we take what we know or experience on the mat, and then we just want to apply it to everything else. And we think that
Hmm.
this means that, when really these are like two different contexts.
Yeah, and two different like study designs. You can, if
Yes,
you're gonna
Travis.
study people in a yoga or whatever nasal
Mm-hmm.
breathing setting,
Mm-hmm.
acutely would be the word for like right now,
Short term,
and see
right?
what the short term benefits are. That's easy enough to do. Not easy to do, but easy enough to do.
Yeah,
Any
right.
human subjects research is difficult. But then if you wanted to say, well, we're gonna follow people for a long period of time, and then we're going to see what effect
Right.
this has, which is even hard to measure.
It is. And we're going to talk.
It-
Yeah.
yeah, so it's just a different context, and there's I would imagine much less research, if any, that has really done exactly that.
That's
Yet
right.
we hear those claims.
That's 100%. And I think that's like a big part of like the message of this episode is, yeah, yeah. I mean, we would need to see some actual scientific research that actually suggests a causal link between something like mouth breathing and health issues. We need to see that done over time. And I don't even know, you'd have to assign mouth breathing to someone or assess, you're a nose breather or mouth breather. But we're actually going to talk today about how even assessing that is actually just not this easy thing. We think that maybe someone breathes this way, but you don't really know. Or
Yeah,
it's hard to know without objective measurements. And so anyway, but like a
yeah,
study over time, you'd have to somehow identify that, and then follow people over time.
right. So that's sort of almost not even enough, because if you just identify, like you said, it's hard to identify, but even if you could and did identify, are you a nose breather or a mouth breather,
Hmm.
the groups aren't random. You need,
Hmm.
and there could be systematic differences between those two
Exactly.
groups that are underlying this whole thing. So yeah, the gold standard study design would be a randomized controlled
Hmm.
trial where you like, the kids game where you're like, I've got your nose. You would take
Yeah.
people's noses away. No, you would
Yes.
I don't know, you would give them a nose clip, or
Plug their
yeah,
nose, which
plug their
actually
nose.
James Nestor did in the book Breath. And I'm just throwing
Oh
that in,
wow.
in there because, yeah, that's a book that we're kind of wanting to talk about
Hmm.
today. But he did that personally to
Right.
himself, to one person. He did that.
N equals one. Yeah. So you'd have to
Yes.
do that to a lot of people at random assignment. So half the people get the
Hmm.
nose plug, half the people get the tape on their mouth. And then that you'd have to keep them that way for a long time, and
Right.
then follow them for an even longer time to see what are the long-term effects of that. And that's
100%.
just, that hasn't been done to my
That
knowledge and
isn't
probably never will be done. So then you're going
exactly.
to saying, well, we're going to identify people. There could be problems with that. And then there could be problems even with the identification itself. So
Yeah, there's
the
just
point is
so
that
many
the research
problems
is
there.
hard to do.
Yeah, it's hard to do, hasn't been done to our knowledge, and if it hasn't been done, then I'm just curious, like, where these strong claims are coming from, that,
Right.
like, breathing through your nose is super important for optimal
Yeah.
health, like,
Right.
where
So it's
has that been
not,
tested?
yeah, we can't be sure that it is or it isn't, but we can be sure that we don't know. So
That's
anyone
right, that's
who's
100%
making
right.
the strong claim that it is better is operating off of evidence that is insufficient to make that strong of a claim.
That's precisely right. It's like the research isn't there yet, so we're, like, reaching ahead of the research, I guess, and making these big
Yeah.
claims,
But it
and if
sounds like James Nestor's N=1
yeah.
research was enough for him.
Oh,
Actually, for him, it is enough for him. But that's, you can't then
right.
extrapolate a case
Yeah.
study out to the broader population.
Exactly, and I'm sure that our science educator, Rachel David, will talk about that when we talk to her about this book. Yeah, pretty sure she'll
Mhm.
bring that up. So anyway, Travis, why don't we? I don't think we need to spend a lot of time talking about this, but let's touch on what research has suggested about nasal breathing. That's like within a breathing practice, and that might be within a yoga practice. It might be pranayama, or just some other breathing techniques that aren't
Sure.
necessarily within yoga. So, breathing through the nose, it's obviously smaller airways than breathing through the mouth. So, if you want to breathe slowly, breathing through the nose is kind of like where it's at, because breathing through the
Mhm.
mouth, you can just take in a lot more air
Right.
volume. And
Makes
so,
sense from an
yeah,
exercise
slow
standpoint.
breathing. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So slow breathing naturally happens, or it's slower when you're breathing through the nose. Like that airway just kind of facilitates slowing down of the breath. So a lot of the research tends to focus on this breath rate of 6 breaths per minute being kind of what's qualified or what counts as like slow breathing. And it's the typical breath rate of just like a normal healthy human is like 10 to 15 breaths per minute. So when
Mm.
you slow the breath down to about 6 breaths per minute, that would be considered slow breathing in a lot of this research. And that tends to be this kind of quote like magic number that seems to be the number of breaths per minute that at which like at that rate, that's when there tend to be these advantages that can happen or these positive benefits. And it kind of boils down to like a 5-second inhale and a 5-second exhale, and
Nice
then
round
do that
number.
6 times. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So just like slowing down the breath. So what do we know about what like slowing down the breath can do? I mean, I think we all just intuitively know that that can calm us down and it
Mhm.
can relax us. And especially if someone's feeling kind of anxious or a little stressed, like if you pause and take some slow breaths, that just has this naturally calming effect.
Totally.
Or we might call it like down regulating is kind of a term you tend to hear. It on a like a physiological level or a nervous system level activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which we know and we've discussed on the podcast before. That's like your rest and digest side of the autonomic nervous system, and then you have your
Mhm.
more fight or flight, which is the sympathetic, which tends to be more associated with was taking in like breathing faster, fight or flight, like sympathetic, taking in more breath so that you have more oxygen available to like power your muscles so that you could fight or run away, things like that.
Mhm.
That's why
Yeah,
like
or
breathing more
exercise.
quickly is yes, or exercise, exactly, which we talked about in a previous episode. Like when you exercise, you are upregulating the sympathetic nervous system, but that's a good thing.
Right.
It's not a bad thing. Like it's really all about kind of a balance between the two and just like not being super dominant in one versus the other, like chronically.
Mhm.
So breathing practices can be great for activating the parasympathetic nervous system and just kind of a lot of that like calming, down regulating nature. They also seem to like these slow breathing practices. They also seem to enhance like just general well-being. They can also be really good techniques for helping with things like pain, both acute and chronic pain. There's like a good amount of evidence that supports that just like simple slow breathing techniques can have positive benefits for things like pain. So, and they're just really good, just kind of hand in hand, built into something like a yoga practice. We just have that like slower, controlled breath like built into that. And
Mm-hmm.
another positive benefit from slow breathing techniques is reducing blood pressure. So they can be
Mm.
helpful, especially for people who have hypertension or chronically elevated blood pressure. Like a
Mm-hmm.
practice of slow breathing, done regularly over time, like as a practice,
So would that be
can
like,
help.
you'd be prescribed 10 minutes of slow breathing
Hmm.
once a day, or that could be part of the prescription,
Totally, that could be part of the prescription. Yeah, like
whether that's
just
in
sit
a,
down.
yeah, in a seated context, or maybe you could get that out of a yoga practice.
Right. So I think that like we just kind of wanted to lay this out because like we really want to emphasize that breath work is another word for it, for like breath practices and breath
Mm-hmm.
techniques, can be very valuable for all of these reasons and more. And that's like super well established. It's very evidence based to say that. And there, if those types of outcomes are important for someone, that is a really good reason to do something like a yoga practice, or a mindfulness practice that incorporates like breath practice, or just any breath practice. Like they're definitely not doing nothing. They can be doing a lot, like in
Score
this.
one for the life force. So you said
Hmm.
pranayama, like another term for that in the English translation, of course, would be like the life force control. And
That's
it's like,
right. That's
wow,
right.
there's some scientific evidence that supports literally that it's not just breath, but there are ties to other health
Hmm.
improvements in health conditions.
That's right. Which makes sense to me, because so much is so interconnected in the body, like psychology and physiology, and there's just it's not like so separate. So
Right.
when you slow down the breath, it's just going to influence you on many levels. So it doesn't
Hmm.
surprise me that research actually shows like tangible health improvements from something like a breath practice. So those were just like some of the main bullet points benefits that I wanted to pull out, and there's obviously more. And there's a ton of research, like just it's not hard to find like what evidence that supports all of that.
Hmm.
So okay, so that is really good support for a breathing practice within, like a temporary, you're consciously, intentionally slowing down the breath.
Which is a key
And
point, right?
yes, right. Because that's a lot different than when
Hmm.
you're off the yoga mat and you're in your day-to-day life and you're moving around. And then there we have reset to our unconscious breath pattern, which is autonomic. It's automatic. It's just controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And it's thankfully not something that we have to think about, or generally. I mean, of course, there are actual, respiratory conditions out there, of course, COPD, asthma, things like that. But
Hmm.
we're talking about like your baseline kind of healthy individual. So anyway, generally healthy people who are moving around through the world and walking and talking and don't have like a diagnosed respiratory condition,
Hmm.
breathing isn't something that they need to think about. It just happens automatically, and that's a really good thing. It's
Mm. Yeah, that'd be a
it's
lot to
nice.
worry about.
Because do you know how many breaths a day on
Well, you just
average?
said 10 to 15 per minute.
That's right.
So 10 to 15 times 60 times 24, right? Whatever that
Yeah, I
is a
hear
lot
it
of
is
breaths.
20 to 22,000 a day, something like that, breaths a
Hmm.
day. Something like it's like a very high number. So that if we were really going out of our way to consciously control how we breathe day to day on a day-to-day level, I mean that would overload us cognitively.
Yeah,
Like I
they
don't know
wouldn't,
how we'd function.
right, we wouldn't be able to do much else besides counting our breaths, or
Yeah,
like
yes.
deliberately
Or
making sure
deliberately
we're inhaling and exhaling.
through the right hole or something like that. Like the nose
Yeah.
versus the mouth, is one way that you might. But there's also, that's just which hole you breathe through. But then there's like, how fast am I breathing? Because there are
Hmm.
claims that like you should
Hmm.
be breathing slowly because
Hmm.
everybody chronically hyperventilates or overbreathes, and that is the root cause of so many health issues. That's like Buteyko Breathing Method.
So
That's
slowly but more shallowly.
that's right. It's not necessarily slow and deep. It's slow and shallow is what they
That's
advocate.
surprising. It's interesting, but I guess
I
it
know
makes
it's a
sense
little counterintuitive. Yeah.
if they're saying,
Um,
well, people are breathing, they're over breathing and they're breathing too deeply because they're breathing through. Are they also claiming that it's yeah? They're also claiming because it's the people are breathing through their mouth, right?
That's right. Yes,
Okay,
100%. It's like, I mean, basically, if you look, like, if I look at my social media feed, I will just inevitably see posts where they're just like, where the person who created it is like, "You're breathing wrong," just like you,
sure,
the viewer, and I'm going
right,
to tell you how to breathe right. It's like this assumption. It's a baseline assumption that everybody is breathing wrong, and that a big part of that is breathing through the mouth, right?
right. So then, if everybody's breathing wrong, then
Right.
I wonder.
Right. If every, well, do you remember, Travis, one time you showed me a post or you forwarded it to me where someone said, literally, they said 80% of you or us or whatever are breathing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And they used that term 80%. Do you remember that? I don't know if you're, but you sent that to me and I was just like, oh, I find that so frustrating because it's an assumption. First of all, it's an assumption that
Mm-hmm.
you know how everybody's breathing, and it's also an assumption that you know what's the right way to breathe.
Right.
But also, we just established some facts about breathing and the positive benefits it can have, like within a breathing practice context, or breathing through the nose, I should say, and slowing down the breath. But if we also want to talk about like facts with nasal breathing versus oral breathing, the research is pretty clear that that 80% number that social media post said 80% of us are breathing wrong. The research is clear that 80% of people breathe 100% through their nose.
What the heck?
80% of
Well,
people.
it's not as shocking, and we wouldn't be talking about it if I wouldn't have sent you the post if it was like, well, 20% of you are doing it wrong. It's like, well, that's probably wouldn't have even shown up
Exactly.
on my feed because it's not as shocking.
It's
So
not as
so first
shocking.
of all, like you said, it's like, well, you're telling me that one way is right and one way is wrong. Second of all, you have the numbers switched because it's only
That's
20%
100%
of you
right.
who are doing it wrong according to what I deem right and wrong. Oh, you know what?
Exactly.
I think I do remember this post in question now,
You
which we will
do.
also not link in the show notes.
That's right. Well, it was one of just a sea of posts like this,
Sure. Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
it's almost like the 80% figure, just like, I don't know, it stands out or something, but then we want to flip it and be like, oh, it's actually 80% of people breathe wrong. But
Oh, that's
actually,
funny.
80% of people breathe with their mouths, their lips fully sealed, and they breathe 100% through the nose. 80%.
Wow.
I know. I think it's really cool to know that. And it's also cool to know that nasal breathing is reflexive. It's like I guess you could say natural. It's the natural way that the human body wants to breathe. So this
Hmm.
is all kind of, like points for nasal breathing, basically. Like nasal breathing is a good thing. It's a good thing. This is the thing you always hear anywhere that you read about nasal breathing. Everybody says these three things. They say nasal breathing will warm, humidify, and filter the air. Like as you breathe in
Mm,
through your nose, it should warm, filter, and humidify the air. I
right.
always see that trifecta of the three things. And that you don't get
Versus
that
if you're
as,
right,
yeah,
you
you
don't
don't get
get
that
that
as
if you're
much through
doing
the
it through
mouth.
the mouth.
Right.
So it won't warm it
Or
because it
humidify
doesn't
it.
have to go through the same passageway and
That's
then
right.
humidifying. And then what was the third thing? Oh, filtration.
Filters.
So the
Yeah.
filtration, I guess, is coming through like your nose hairs or whatever else.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. And
okay.
I think also on a microscopic level, I'm actually, just because we're talking about the filtration, I just want to jump to, in my notes here, there's this really cool study from 1952.
Oh,
It's
wow.
from 71 years ago, and it's a really long time ago. If you were born in 1952, you would be like a senior citizen today. But the reason that I think the study is really cool is because, well, many reasons, but one is that already back then, already in 1952, these claims about mouth breathing being so bad for us were already being questioned, and this study was questioning them. It was like this review is set out to separate facts from conjecture, like about the the poor health effects of mouth breathing, and that like nasal breathing is so much better. But anyway, I pulled this quote because I think it's really funny. So in this study, what they write about nasal breathing is they say, when the air first enters the nose, the coarse hairs just inside the anterior nares, and a nare is a nostril,
Mm.
prevent the entrance of prevent the entrance of gross particulate matter such as leaves, twigs, or insects. And
Mm.
I just think it's really funny to think of inhaling like leaves or
Well, wait,
twigs or
but bugs,
insects.
don't people? I've heard that you inhale like one bug a year and you don't even know it, or
For
more.
sure. Yeah, I think like when you're talking or something, and, if
Yeah.
you're outside and your mouth, just like a little gnat goes in or whatever. But I just thought it was really funny that in 1952 they were like, the nose will filter the branches and the leaves out of your nasal
Yeah. I
passageways.
hadn't been worried about that before, but maybe I should be now.
Exactly, exactly. So that when you breathe through your nose, you will warm, humidify, and filter the air. Like you will, like
Mhm.
that. And that's a part of the reason why nasal breathing is reflexive and why 80% of people 100% breathe through their nose.
Yeah,
Now
that's
there's
good
an
stuff.
right, exactly. And there's
Because
another
if that stuff's
thing.
not happening and you're breathing through your mouth, then you have to do something extra. Like let's say for the warming standpoint, well, you want the air to be warm, so there's increased blood
Probably increased
circulation.
blood, yeah, in a different part of the tract, like
Yeah,
down
so
in the
you're
lungs
like
or
having to
something.
do extra work that
Yeah.
you wouldn't necessarily have to have done before.
Yeah, so it may be less efficient in terms of the warming if you breathe
Hmm.
through your mouth. And there's this other thing about nasal breathing that I see talked about a lot, and this is actually big in the book Breath and also the book The Oxygen Advantage, also in Buteyko, is something called a nitric oxide. Travis, have you heard of nitric oxide?
Like the chemical.
It's a chemical, yeah. Or I guess nitric oxide in connection to something like nasal breathing. I bet you haven't because you haven't really looked into this too much. But basically, nitric oxide is a gas
Hmm.
that is produced in our sinuses and our nasal airways. And it's something that's only produced through the nasal passageways and not through the oral passageways.
Mm.
And nitric oxide is a vasodilator, which means it dilates your blood vessels. So it can help with something like absorbing oxygen, like especially at the area of the lungs. So nitric oxide is good for that. It also has antimicrobial qualities, so it could be helpful for like preventing infections, or fighting like something that you inhale that might be infectious.
Like a
And
leaf.
yeah, like, or a twig. Exactly. So this is true and this is real that we have nitric oxide produced in the nasal passageways and it's not produced in the
Mm.
oral passageways. And this I hear claimed a lot for why it's really important that we all close our mouths and breathe through the nose
Hmm.
because the nitric oxide. And while for sure it seems like that is, that's helpful, I wonder, and as far as I know, research has not been done on this. But I wonder if if you breathe through your mouth, just like, okay, well, actually, let me move on to my next point, which is going to be related to what we were just saying. Basically, we tend to think, how easy, as we've talked about, it is to think about things in black and white terms,
Hmm.
good, bad. We also tend to think in a black and white term as far as nose versus mouth breathing. And we tend to think that like
Mm.
I'm either breathing through my nose or I'm breathing through my mouth, like it's black or white,
Hmm.
one is
Hmm.
on, one is off. And
Hmm.
I mean, I feel like that's a huge assumption people don't even think about when they hear, these claims. But
Yeah.
actually, if your mouth is open, you are still breathing through your nose.
Right.
Like if your mouth is open. And if your mouth is open and if you're breathing through your mouth, you're still breathing through your nose. And that's just like known physiologically. Like
Hmm.
there's no, but nobody says that when they talk about how important it is to breathe through the nose. But it's called oronasal breathing. So you have
Hmm.
oral, which is your mouth, you have nasal, and then you have oronasal. And
Hmm.
basically, unless your nasal passages are occluded or obstructed, like if
Hmm.
you're stuffed up, you have allergies, unless
Yeah.
they're occluded, even if you're breathing through your mouth, you're also breathing through your nose. Like you just are. So my question is, yes, the nitric oxide, you do create that. You also create that in your blood vessels and in other parts of your body. But with regard to respiration, it is in the nasal passages only. But even if you're breathing through your mouth, you're also still breathing through your nose. So, do you still get the nitric oxide? Do you still get enough? Like, how much do you need? Like, what's the percentage? It's just like, these are questions that I don't believe research has been done on. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, Travis, our episode a few episodes back when we talked to Claire Zai about the menstrual cycle, and how that may or may not affect women and strength training.
Hmm.
And I just feel like this is a really good example to bring up because she showed us or explained that in research does reveal that, like, in this kind of isolated manner, the different phases of your menstrual cycle can affect something like strength. Like if you take one single finger and you push it down like into a table,
Hmm.
it may
Yeah,
be a
I
little
remember.
weaker in one phase versus the other. So then people see this like isolated thing, and then they're like, therefore,
Hmm.
when you're strength training in this phase of your menstrual cycle, you are going to be weaker and you need to be careful in all of this. But actually,
Hmm.
when research actually looked at in practice actual strength training, which is a lot more than just isolated little muscle, it's everything involves your whole body and compound movements, that then there were no differences. So it's like, it's so easy to see something in isolation and then want to extrapolate and jump to conclusions. And I just wonder if this nitric oxide claim or fear or whatever is like, yes, it's in your nasal cavities, but if your mouth is open and you happen to be oronasal breathing, does that mean that you're somehow like depriving yourself of the amount of nitric oxide that you need?
Right.
Like, do we even know that? Like, because that's different than just saying, yeah, there's nitric oxide in the that's isolation, but then we're talking whole body breathing. Do you know what
Mm.
I mean?
Yeah. So it could still be going on because you're also breathing through your nose when you're breathing through your mouth, and the nitrous oxide is produced in
It's nitric
night.
oxide,
Sorry,
just FYI.
that's
Yeah.
a different chemical gas
Yeah.
compound.
Yeah.
Uh, it's produced in other parts of your body, so maybe
Yeah.
it can be
Like maybe you're
made up
getting
for.
enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like we don't know. I think that's the point, is like, we don't know. So it's one thing to know that the nitric oxide is produced in the passageways, but it's another to make the jump to, therefore, if you don't breathe through your nose, all these health
Right.
problems are going to happen. Like, we just don't know. We don't know.
So
So
nitrous oxide is laughing gas that they
that's
give you
right.
at the dentist
Yeah.
office for a tooth extraction. Different,
Yeah. Yeah.
very different.
Right. But
But
nitric
yeah,
oxide is this vasodilator. Yeah.
yeah, I
So
definitely hear what you're saying in terms of like that's something that we should question. And but like you said, if you're fully occluded, like you've got a cold, your allergies are bad, then that's a different scenario because then
yeah,
you're not, what did you say, the process of breathing.
oronasally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
oral nasal. You're not oral nasally breathing if you're fully 100% occluded.
Right. Right. So, Travis, check this out. We already established that research lets us know that 80% of people breathe 100% nasally. So, yeah, we
Hmm.
know that. Now, I found this stat on the Wikipedia entry for mouth breathing. And when I went back to its source, it was like sourced to a textbook, and I couldn't really get the actual textbook. So I don't have an actual research study for this, whereas I do with like everything else that I've said. But this is linked back to a textbook. But in
Hmm.
the Wikipedia entry, they wrote that yes, 80% of people breathe 100% nasally. And of the 20% of people who are not breathing 100% nasally,
Hmm.
85% don't, because of a nasal obstruction like allergies or congestion. So this is getting a little
Gotcha.
tricky with the numbers and the percentages here.
Gotta
But
bust out my calculator.
exactly. But of the 20% of like our population who doesn't already 100% breathe nasally, then 85% of them are just not breathing 100% nasally because maybe they're congested or something, right? Something's blocking their nose. And then the presumption would be once that clears up, they resume their nasal breathing again. So,
Hmm.
so just to be a little getting into those statistics. So out of that, so that's 85% of the 20%. Like
Hmm.
they're gonna default back to nasal once they decongest. So that leaves, you can help me make sure I'm doing this math right, but that should leave us 3 people out of every
Yeah.
100 who are not breathing 100% nasally, like for some other reason. Does that sound right?
That checks out. So 85% of 20 is 17, leaving
Yes.
3 a remainder who are not going to presumably clear up in the somewhat near future because their issue is temporarily related to sinus or nose congestion or
That's
whatever. So their issue
that's
is some
right.
other reason, and whatever that reason is, maybe they would clear up at some point, or maybe they wouldn't, and then they need to figure out why that is.
Right. Or those 3%, they might not even be
3
blocked in
people.
their nose. Oh yeah, sorry.
Well, oh yeah, 3 people and
It's still
3%.
3. It's the
That's
same.
correct.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
not it's
3 people out of 100.
that the point is they're not breathing 100% nasally, not because their nose is congested. So it's just some other reason, basically.
Yeah,
And that would be like, maybe if you were going to say that nasal breathing is the best and mouth breathing is the worst, then maybe that's like applied to maybe that 3% of people, right?
it's
And we're kind
not
of
a lot.
questioning whether that's how, like whether we can really say that, but it's 3% of people that are not already 100% breathing nasally, or wouldn't be if they presumably wouldn't be if they weren't
Right.
blocked.
So that's a pretty small minority of the population as opposed to everybody's breathing wrong.
Exactly, and that's like the main point of why we're kind of bringing that up, right? It's just a far cry from you, just like the general you.
You on Instagram.
Yeah, exactly, are breathing wrong. It's like actually 3 out of every 100 of you are. Maybe,
Mhm.
only maybe, but yeah. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think the idea is built into these claims is that we're breathing poorly, we're breathing wrong, like everybody, like chronically the population is. But in actuality, nasal breathing is reflexive, and pretty much everybody nasally breathes. A small minority of people, might breathe in combination with like nose and mouth. It's just
Hmm.
not the huge claims that we tend to hear that are
Yeah.
just like, you're breathing wrong.
Everybody's breathing wrong.
Yeah, it's like a small minority of people who don't breathe,
Yeah.
100% through their
Which
nose.
lends to the notion that most of us probably don't have to worry about this.
Yes, exactly, Travis. That was kind of one of the big takeaways, is like, you probably don't
Yeah.
have to worry about
There
this.
might be
Yeah.
5% of people who,
And even then, I just don't know, like how are we assessing mouth breathing or determining that someone is? So we also know from research that just because someone's like mouth is open, it as we've already established, we know they're still breathing through their nose unless their nose is occluded. But
mhm.
people can have their lips open or their mouth open and they still can be 100% breathing through their nose. Like, you don't know just by looking at the mouth opening.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah.
there was this great
Makes sense.
study that was done, that was called Nose Mouth Distribution of Respiratory Airflow in quote mouth breathing children. Quote mouth breathing children. So these respiratory doctors, or maybe they were ENT doctors, ear, nose, throat. They did the study where they took 120 children who had been clinically diagnosed as mouth breathers. So they had been clinically diagnosed as mouth breathers. But these researchers, they're like kind of concerned about the way that mouth breathing tends to be clinically diagnosed, because it's generally based on like subjective analyses. It's based on, you just kind of maybe look at the person. You could ask some questions. You might do something called rhinomanometry, which is measuring like airflow pressure, like in the nasal. It measures nasal airflow pressure. So they just kind of go based on those things, and then they determine whether they diagnose that person as a mouth breather or not. But what these researchers are suggesting is that like these typical modes of diagnosing mouth breathing are actually all subjective, and they're not objectively actually measuring actual airflow and the ratio between
Mm.
nasal and oral. So they took these 120 kids who they'd all been diagnosed as mouth breathers, and they
Hmm.
actually objectively assessed their airflow between mouth versus nose. And they found that their objective measurements did not correlate with the clinical diagnoses. And
Ooh.
they were
Uh-oh.
like, yeah, and they have this technique that they recommend where they put like the person in, it's called a plethysmograph. It's like this almost whole body container, but their head is out, and it's measuring volume change in the body. So it can measure the volume change of the lungs. And that's how
Mm-hmm.
they would assess like total airflow in and out. And then at the same time, they have they put a CPAP mask on the nose. So they put a mask on the subject's nose, and then they're measuring just the nasal portion of the breath. So they're able to
Oh,
simultaneously get nasal
how
portion
much?
compared to
Yeah,
total, and then that's how they get the
that's
ratio.
genius.
I know, and they're like, this is the way that you objectively measure
Not
airflow,
just
but
from looking
nobody's
at
doing
someone.
this.
Well,
Exactly.
yeah, it's hard. I don't can't even pronounce a plethysmograph, let alone
Plethysmograph, yes.
know what it is or know how to set it up. So yeah, you're saying whatever their clinical way of diagnosing this is, probably just from looking at them and talking to them and asking them questions,
Yep.
they're identifying 120 nose mouth
Mouth breathing
breathers.
kids.
And yeah, and then that study that actually truly measured mouth breathing didn't really show the same thing.
No, it didn't correlate at all. And they found that like the amount that the lips were apart also didn't correlate with the amount that they nasal breathed. And
Wow.
some
So
kids
right,
had, yeah,
if if you're saying, well, if your mouth is open, you must be mouth breathing, that's not the case at all.
exactly. But that's
It's
the
not a
thing.
good proxy.
It's 100% not a good proxy. And like, yeah, some of the kids had really wide open lips and they breathed 100% through the nose. And other kids had a lot closer together lips and they breathed less through the nose. So it's just like you
Hmm.
can't tell. And I think that we just want to look at people. You know, it's also a cultural stereotype we have about like the mouth breather. I'm sure you're aware of that stereotype, right?
Like they're louder,
Oh, you don't know
or
about the stereotype? It's
what's the
usually that they're
stereotype?
less intelligent. It's like it's a
But
mouth breather is a pejorative term. It's like kind of,
it didn't. Isn't there some research that has shown children who mouth breathe are like poorer performers academically, or is that problematic because of the way that we have
there
difficulty
is
measuring mouth
some
breathing?
research. Yes, there is some research that has shown a correlation between mouth breathing children and cognitive performance.
Yeah, which
Uh,
isn't causation.
That's right. It's not causation, it's correlation. So there are two big problems with that research. And one is I actually looked at some of these studies and I was curious, like, well, how did they actually assess whether the kids were mouth breathing? And they didn't do
Mm-hmm.
the objective airflow. They just did
Mm-mm.
this, they just did subjective measurements. So they probably, I don't know, the kid had an open mouth and they're like, you're a mouth breather, you know?
Right. So it's actually not breathing is correlated with academic performance or poorer academic performance. It's mouth, how much your mouth is open, which actually doesn't have anything to do with mouth breathing.
You're right. Like, if, you're totally right, Travis. Like, that's what those studies would show. Yeah,
Mm,
yeah, yeah. If I mean, because they were not measuring objective airflow, and like that,
myth
you really need to
busted.
quantitatively assess that to determine how someone is breathing. So that's the first big problem with like with that research, which is like a smallish body of research that has tended to show this. And I would just suggest, in general, I think that a lot of the research that is done on this is partly motivated by the bias in our society that mouth breathers are, you know, somehow less than or less intelligent. Like and it's like kind of an insult to call someone a mouth breather. I think we just have this cultural idea that mouth breathing is bad, so we're going to go out of our way to look for ways in which it must be bad. But
Mm-hmm.
our friend of the podcast, Greg Nuckols, we actually heard him on his podcast talking about this exact topic, which helped kind of
Mm-hmm.
like inspire us for things that we were thinking about for our episode. And he talked about this specifically and the research done on the kids and their cognitive abilities. He didn't talk about the problems with even assessing mouth breathing. I don't know that he's
Mm-hmm.
aware of that. But what he talked about was, first of all, it's only correlation. So you could certainly look at that. And if you have a bias that mouth breathing is bad, you could be like, okay, that supports my bias. Like mouth breathing made them less intelligent or whatever, impaired cognitive ability.
Mm-hmm.
However, we know, as we've already talked about in this episode, we've got like the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. And you have like stress is more associated with the sympathetic nervous system and fight or flight. And when you're more stressed, you're more likely to maybe breathe more through your mouth, you know, in order to like fuel the body with more oxygen. So what Greg Nuckols was proposing was that the actual connection between those phenomena in that research, if it's even a connection, it's probably reverse causation, where these kids may have been performing poor academically, but they were also stressed. And it may just be the fact that like they were stressed, which was causing the poor academic performance and potentially causing what the researchers seem to perceive as mouth breathing. So does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. So the stress could precede the poor performance, or it could come as a result of the poor performance. And like you said, it could be reverse causation, where instead of the mouth breathing causing the poor performance, it's the poor performance is causing the mouth breathing by way of increasing stress, or the mouth breathing. It could be this third or lurking variable where it's just, yeah, they're mouth breathing, but the poor academic performance is really just due to their stress. Anyway, the point being that they didn't measure any of those things, and they didn't assess them. They didn't do they were It was just a correlation, cross-sectional observational study, no experimental manipulation of groups, and so you can't prove causation from that type of study design.
100%. I think you put that so perfectly. Yes. And yeah, I hadn't even thought about that connection between potentially if you were a poor performer academically, that could make you stressed, which
Right.
could
So you
then
don't know
maybe,
where.
I didn't even think about
Yeah,
that
they didn't
way. But
measure
yeah,
stress at all, right? But
yeah,
the stress
right.
could have come before or after,
Yeah, like
and
as a
then
result of it's just so many
yeah,
factors going on there. But like as a society, we think of mouth breathing, like I said, it's like a pejorative term. We have a societal bias that it's a bad thing. So I just think that's part of what's going on with all of this is that we just want to think that mouth breathing is bad. And so I think that can fuel our opinions, our how quickly we are to believe these claims, and maybe fuel some of the research. I think especially a lot of the research on kids because there's a lot of claims about mouth breathing kids and like how when kids mouth breathe it changes the face of the shape or it
I've heard
creates
that stuff too. Yeah,
teeth malocclusion like crooked teeth, things like that mouth breathing causes that. But even back in 1952, that really cool study I was talking about that was talking about inhaling the twigs, they were also questioning all of that, and they were just like that it could easily be that like genetics predispose them to a certain facial shape, and also they were speculating like certain skull shapes may just predispose someone to like breathe more through their mouth, like it just could. And they were just like there have been no experimental studies that have actually looked at this. It's just if anything, it's just correlation, but we can't make causal claims. And that was back in 1952. So it's just like it's been so long since then. And all I've seen in more modern research looking at that connection between mouth breathing and skull shape, they don't even see a correlation. In fact, that study of the 120 kids, the quote mouth breathers, they also analyzed that. They tried to connect like how they breathe, whether, what percentage through the nose and the mouth, connecting that to their face shape. And there was no connection on which you could make predictions of what their face shape looked like.
Hmm.
So yeah, so that seems to be also very questionable, and again could just be kind of being rooted from bias.
right.
Anyway, Travis, there's something else pretty important that we want to get to in this conversation before we bring in Dr. Rachel David to talk about the book Breath by James Nestor. So I'm
Hmm.
wondering if we could it's all still related, but it's just shifting our conversation a bit. I think we've kind of laid out some good arguments for why maybe some of these claims that we hear about nasal breathing can be a little bold, especially based on what actual research and evidence we have for that. And
Hmm.
it's just kind of like, yes, we already, like almost everybody already breathes reflexively through the nose. This is not a problem that we need to tell everybody that they need to do. But
Hmm.
even for people who don't breathe through their nose, even people who maybe breathe 100% through their mouth, which is rare, I don't even think we have the research that shows a causal connection between mouth breathing and all these health problems. Like if research on that is done, like show it to us or do it, and then we can maybe start to justify those big claims we hear. But I think
Right.
until then, we probably need to be tentative, right, in like what we're claiming.
Hmm.
That's kind of the overarching summary, right, of what we're talking about, of
For
what we
sure.
presented here. Okay, so let's bring all of that to then looking at the Buteyko method and the two books. This is what also we wanted to focus on today. So the Buteyko breathing method is it's this, and I know, Travis, you hadn't heard of Buteyko, so I
Mm-mm.
get to tell you about it too. I've heard a lot about it because in some circles in the yoga world, it's pretty popular. And also in general, just in like the wellness, holistic healing, natural healing worlds in general, Buteyko tends to have a presence. And it's basically, it's breath techniques, like breathing techniques, and like trying to retrain your day-to-day breath so that you breathe 100% nasally, even though almost all of us already do that, but whatever. You're supposed to
Mhm.
retrain your breath so that you breathe 100% nasally, and you're supposed to take shallower, like take in less air. And that's because everybody is supposed to be, we are supposed to be a widespread chronic population of, quote, overbreathers or chronic hyperventilators. These are the claims. I've looked into the research on this, and these claims about chronic hyperventilation leading to the 150 health issues or diseases that Buteyko claims it leads to, and that Buteyko also claims that Buteyko breathing will cure. There's no support in the evidence for that. And the whole theory behind that, like, first of all, the idea that we all overbreathe. I don't know if there's evidence for that, but then the idea that chronically overbreathing is chronic hyperventilation, and that leads to lower carbon dioxide levels, and that is then at this metabolic level, that's what then contributes to all of these diseases. That's their theory, basically, and that's why they want to
So
retrain. Does that make
it's a
sense?
lot
That's
of
the
it's a
theory.
lot of a lot of steps to extrapolate.
Thank you, Travis. That's 100%.
150 chronic diseases or diseases.
Yeah, and guess what? Guess which disease? I mean, I can send you links to all of the diseases they claim, but they claim that our bad breathing causes
Mhm.
up to 150 diseases, including COVID, diabetes, high blood pressure, hemorrhoids, impotency, sterility, HIV, and AIDS, and over 140 more, all caused by the fact
Well,
that we overbreathe.
I'm not that kind of doctor, but my understanding is that the way that you contract those diseases requires something pretty different in many cases from
Yes.
whatever overbreathing means.
Right. So the whole theory behind the system was debunked like back in the 90s. And I was even reading
Mhm.
research where researchers were like suggesting that we don't even use the term hyperventilation syndrome, like that goes away as a diagnosis, like it's not a thing. I don't know.
Hmm.
But anyway, Buteyko breathing was started in the 1950s by a physiologist named Konstantin Buteyko in Ukraine. And
Mhm.
it was later that it started to spread more widespread. But the deal is, here's the origin story of Buteyko, and this should remind you of like our last episode, which was on complementary and alternative
I was gonna
medicines.
say, just
Yeah,
when you mentioned wellness, it's like we pretty thoroughly discussed that in our last. Was it the last episode?
it was the last, yeah.
Yeah.
And something that Jonathan Jerry, our science communicator guest, pointed out was that with a lot of alternative medicine modalities, they were started by like this lone wolf or like this one person, usually a man, who had
Yeah.
this one realization one day, and then they're like, "This is the way everything works," and then they start their
It
system.
fits.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what happened here. So Buteyko, he was in World War II and came back, and then he was a physiologist, so he had major health issues, and this was like in his 20s. He had really high blood pressure, hypertension, and I think he was diagnosed, the story is a little vague, but he was diagnosed as not having very much longer to live because of his hypertension.
Mm.
So his story is that one night he walked out and he saw a bright light, and then he was kind of like thinking that this was going to be the end, like this, like he was
Oh,
just in real health trouble. And he noticed his breathing, and his breathing was super rapid and like fast paced. And then he had this like stroke of genius in the moment that like, my fast paced breathing is not the result of my health condition, it's the cause of my health condition. And so then he in that moment started slowing down his breath, and he felt better. And then he was like, wait, we're all breathing fast, and that's what's causing all these things. And then he tried it out on a few other people. He tried to get them to slow their breathing, and they felt better. And then he was like, this is the Buteyko method, and he established his method.
I don't
So,
even know what to say to that.
well, one thing that's cool to say is Science-Based Medicine is a great organization and website, and they do a really good job of taking a really science-based look at so many of these claims. There are a couple articles they have on Buteyko method, and if it's okay with you, I just want to read you this one from this one science-based medicine article. So they relayed that story that I just relayed to you about Buteyko having this
Mm-hmm.
insight. So
Mm-hmm.
they write, it might be that he stumbled in this moment onto an immensely powerful and hitherto unknown insight into human pathophysiology. On the other hand, there may be a more simple explanation. We have in Buteyko a young man recently returned from the battle lines of World War II, suffering from hypertension, which is extremely uncommon in a young man, who is experiencing hyperventilation, flashing lights, and an apparent feeling of impending doom. One would be hard pressed to find a better setup for and description of a panic attack. Slow, controlled breathing that Buteyko described using can not only resolve the acute symptoms of a panic attack, but can also return a sense of control to the person afflicted, reducing their anxiety and potentially alleviating hypertension. Panic attack or stroke of stunning inspiration? Occam's razor might have something to say on the matter. So I think that's a really interesting theory. Who knows? But from the description, it sounds like, maybe he had PTSD post being in the war and was prone to
Yeah.
panic attacks. And maybe he found that slowing down his breath in the face of that panic attack was helpful. And I'm sure it was. But that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't then mean that there's this rational then leap to just, therefore, we're all over breathing and it's causing all these problems, right? So a couple
Yes.
more things. Yes, okay. A couple more things about the Buteyko method. I'm going to be brief. I mentioned earlier that there are two books, The Oxygen Advantage and there's Breath. So it
Mm-hmm.
turns out The Oxygen Advantage by Patrick McKeown came out in 2015, and that was pretty
Mm-hmm.
big and popular, and that very much advocated nasal breathing as the optimal way and the cure for so many of our problems. It turns out that Patrick McKeown, who wrote that book, is the head of Buteyko. He took over the Buteyko organization once Buteyko himself died, early 2000s.
So
Sorry, I
just a
forget the
rebrand.
exact. Yes, and I think in the book he does talk about. I don't think he's pretending that he's not. But
Okay.
it's clearly the book isn't called Buteyko's breathing method. It's called The
Mm-hmm.
Oxygen Advantage. So it's kind of more. I didn't realize when I first heard of that book that it was Buteyko, but it
Mm,
is basically. So
cool.
Patrick McKeown is the new head of Buteyko. He's the director of education and training at Buteyko Clinic International, and he's the president of Buteyko Professionals International. His
And
book,
he's James Nestor's uncle.
yeah.
Just kidding.
Well, you'll see there's a connection there. So
Oh gosh.
James Nestor, his book it's like Buteyko rebranded also, with maybe a little bit added on that James Nestor has come upon in his thinking process. But he interviewed Patrick McKeown in his book. Patrick McKeown endorsed the Breath book, and also in the book Breath, which I've read through, he does a whole profile on Konstantin Buteyko and tells the story and just the whole thing, in a very, upholding way. This is the answer to our
Not as
problems. So
skeptically as you told the story.
exactly, much more reverent. So
Yeah. He
this is
had
what
an
you,
epiphany where God shone the light.
yeah, it's pretty much like that. He didn't use those exact words, but he's basically not critical.
Yeah.
He is not critical of Buteyko. James Nestor. So the book, though, The Oxygen Advantage, that came out by Patrick McKeown, I just want you to know that the person who wrote the foreword to that book, and who's also closely aligned with Patrick McKeown, there's a profile of him on the Buteyko Clinic website. His name is, and I don't know if you've heard of this person before, Dr. Joseph Mercola. Do you know? Are you laughing because you know who
I
that
know
is?
exactly that is. Yeah.
He wrote the
So,
foreword to the book, The Oxygen Advantage. Who is,
just
I have
just
bullet points
throw it in
about
the
who he
trash
is,
now.
but who is Joseph Mercola?
He's just some pseudoscience, but he's very famous.
He's famous. He's a outspoken anti-vaxxer.
Right.
He was, this is according to the Wikipedia page on Joseph Mercola. It says that researchers have identified him as the, quote, chief spreader of coronavirus misinformation online. And he was banned from YouTube on September 29th, 2021, Joseph Mercola.
Oh
So
wow.
he's outspoken anti-vaxxer, misinformation spreader, like you said, pseudoscience, selling pseudoscience. banned from YouTube.
He's the kingpin.
Yeah, he is. He's a big figure in the alternative medicine world.
Yeah.
So I just think, like, yeah, the fact that he wrote the foreword to the Oxygen Advantage, and also Dr. Oz has his quote, his endorsement
I
quote
was
is on
gonna
the
say
cover.
Dr. Oz has to be involved in this somewhere.
Right,
They're
you're so
all
right.
chips off the same block.
He is. So basically just kind of presenting, like, I just want to put these things in perspective. It's one thing in a yoga context to maybe learn about Buteyko breathing and slowing down the breath, and you need to stop breathing so much. These are what the things that they say. But then when you really take a step back and look into these things and you see, I don't what part, like where this is rooted, it's like very much rooted in like the natural medicine side of things, slightly, resentful or suspicious of conventional medicine and a lot of the things we talked about in our last podcast episode.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not the Buteyko method. So let's just say this too. They claim to treat 150 diseases. Buteyko practitioners claim to treat 150, up to 150 diseases. But research, a handful of studies have been done on one disease and its relationship with Buteyko. So research does suggest that Buteyko breathing techniques can help with the perceived symptoms of asthma. It
Okay.
doesn't treat asthma. It doesn't treat it
Sure.
like pulmonary measurements, objective measurements of pulmonary function. Those don't
Mm-hmm.
change after Buteyko, but
Okay.
people's perception of their symptoms can improve through Buteyko, and that can actually result in them feeling less dependence on like using their inhaler.
Super.
So that's supported. And that's like the one claim that it seems that Buteyko breathing may help with. And that's actually supported by a few studies. It makes sense to me, kind of based on what we were talking about with like the panic attack thing. And, when people have an asthma attack, it can be very stressful and it can be
Mm-hmm.
worrisome. And if you can teach yourself like slower breathing, that can give you a sense that you have more control in the moment, and that can calm someone down, and that can certainly help. And this is what's been speculated in the research as to why. It's not that Buteyko helps because it changes carbon dioxide levels and things like that. Like that's like the what's being claimed, but it's not those mechanisms. It's just that people are like maybe having more of a sense of control using their
Makes
breath
sense.
and that makes sense, right? And that may not be unique to Buteyko breathing techniques. That could be a
Yeah.
handful of other breathing techniques where people practice slow breathing that can make them feel better in a situation like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So yes, so research does show, but of course that gets then, like kind of held up as maybe meaning more or being about more than it actually is. But
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So not to say that this is total garbage and it doesn't do
Yes.
anything and you
No, no,
should not
no.
do it, because there actually is some evidence, with the caveat that the explanation that Buteyko gives and the actual scientific explanation may be different.
Yeah,
But then also not to take that and say, well, it worked for asthma, so it works for the other 149 diseases that haven't been studied, but they claim to that it's beneficial for.
exactly. That's a great way of putting it. So yeah, I think you totally get like what I've discovered upon looking into the Buteyko method, the books, this whole topic of nasal versus oral breathing and all of the like ideas about good versus bad. I think, yeah, we are not here to say that nasal breathing is bad. Nasal breathing is good. But does that necessarily mean that mouth breathing is bad? Do we have research to support that? If it's true that nasal breathing is more optimal, and of course, it seems like that could make sense. Like how much, like what's the actual effect? Like I think they would say like the magnitude of the effect,
Right.
if
Yep.
someone actually,
Definitely.
like maybe it's statistically significant that nasal breathing is more optimal, but how much more optimal are we talking about? We have a mouth for a reason. We have the ability to breathe through the mouth for a reason.
Yeah, that's your backup, right? Like
Yeah.
if your nose gets clogged and then you
Good
didn't
thing
have
you
a
have your
mouth,
mouth.
good thing. Yeah.
Right. So I just wonder about, and I don't think we even have research. We don't have research to even show that, but it's like, how big is the effect? And are there so many other things in our life where, yeah, there's something that you might do that might help a little with your optimal health, but do we go around yelling at everybody like, you need to do this thing maybe it's just like there's so many things we might know could improve our health, but we ignore. We're just like, yeah, I don't want to do that. Like maybe this is like that. I don't
Right.
know. Research doesn't know. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm
Yeah,
just
like
wondering?
there are probably bigger fish to fry.
Exactly.
I mean, we just don't know, but there are, we don't know because we don't know what the magnitude of the effect is for mouth breathing versus nose breathing, but we could imagine that there are probably bigger fish to fry.
I think that's exactly, yes.
From
Are we
a like, oh, you're trying to improve your health standpoint.
yes.
Well, you could do a lot of other things
That are actually
besides hyper
super.
focusing. Yeah, that are more supported from a research standpoint to be beneficial than worrying about whether you're breathing through your nose or breathing through your mouth.
That's exactly right, Travis. Yes. At least that's what after thoroughly looking into this, that's kind of my conclusion as well. For now. I mean, if more research comes out, then of course it's all
Sure,
pending on, what's comes out in the research, but
we'll
I don't think there's
we'll do a
anything to
part two
support.
in the
Yeah,
future
exactly.
once we know
So
more.
totally. So with all of that said, let's turn our attention now to our special guest. And this is Dr. Rachel David. She is here to talk to us specifically about the book Breath by James Nestor. And this is because this book is super popular in the yoga world. And these days, because it came out in 2020, so it's pretty new.
Hmm.
Generally, the majority of the times that I hear people advocate nasal breathing, you should breathe through your nose. You should tell your yoga students they need to breathe through your nose. It's because of this book. They're like, just read Breath by James Nestor. It lays out all the
Appeal to
science. That's
authority.
like, yeah, that's what they almost always say in my experience. So we wanted Rachel as a science educator to talk to us about this book, largely just again for our scientifically thinking minds. Like, how do we analyze a book and tell whether it's actually science-based or not? Just because people say a book is science-based, like, is it? And I think that's what we're hoping that Rachel can kind of tell us using this specific example of this book. So yeah, so with that said, let's bring on Dr. Rachel David. Yay. So we are super excited now to bring in Dr. Rachel David. And we're also super excited to introduce you to Rachel and to her work. If you're not familiar with it, Travis and I are big fans of what she's been putting out there for the yoga community. But Rachel is a yoga teacher who lives in London. She has her PhD in immunology and her master's degree in science communication, which I think is so great. Rachel also designs behavior change programs to support those living with chronic conditions, and she facilitates workshops to drive innovation in healthcare. And we are just really thrilled to have her here with us on the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. Thank you so much for being here today, Rachel.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's dive in here, and we'd love to hear, just in your experience, have you seen the book Breath as like a very popular text in the yoga community, and also what have you heard people saying about it?
I think popular doesn't quite capture how popular it is. I'd say it's almost like it's got Bible status amongst a lot of
Whoa.
yoga teachers. So it's being cited as like transformational. People say, you should read this. The breathing practices have become really popular, like pranayama and stuff like that, as a result, and like that's cited as like the reason to
Mm.
to look into it and stuff as the science behind it. Yeah, so Bible, I'd probably say.
Yeah, I mean, it was or is on best-selling lists, right?
Yeah.
And then if so, that's like nationally or internationally, but then if you consider the population of yoga practitioners who would be predisposed to particularly elevating it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Because
exactly. Yeah. But
yeah.
also in this particular case, New York Times bestseller in the popular science category. So you're like, okay, well, everybody says this is like, you know, this is a popular science book, so you have to trust that someone did their work and
Oh,
like check the things, and you know,
yeah.
it's difficult. It's really difficult.
But I think it helps explain why. I mean, one of the things we wanted to ask you about was just like, why do you feel like the book has such Bible-like status? I love how you said that. But I think part of it is that it is just like it's labeled popular science. It's just easy to go along with that and just assume, it's hard, like it's hard for consumers in general to like know how to discern, which is partly why we wanted to have this episode
Yeah,
and this special conversation with you. But
yeah.
yeah, we can't always trust like the labels out there that are put on things. And
Well, I had this conversation with my husband, right? Because he's not a scientist.
right,
He's very cynical and critical, and like he felt the same way about this book as I did. But I was saying, like, as a non-scientist, like, what would you look for? Because I don't really know, right? This is a difficult one. If it's labeled popular science, all the reviews say this is amazing. No one from Nature or Science Magazine or even like, I don't know, Scientific
right.
American or like popular. I couldn't. I actually checked before this call to see like did anyone from a science magazine actually write a review on this, and I couldn't actually find one. So it is all the newspapers and the magazines, the normal magazines that are talking about this. So I guess
That's
that
a
makes it
great
even more
point.
complicated.
But potentially a good tip to look for, like if you're trying to assess, like, well, how scientific is this book? Well, like who are the endorsements like on the back cover, and like what are their credentials? That's such a good point because I know what you mean. I read through all the endorsements of the book Breath also, and it was just a lot of like I felt like a lot of new age and alternative health practitioners. I felt like were a lot of the ones, and like you said, magazines, but not necessarily like scientific organizations.
Yeah, it's like the scientific organizations aren't even taking it seriously enough to review it.
Yeah, possibly. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. That might even be the lack of endorsements there already.
Yeah. So we did want to ask you, kind of turning a little more to the content of the actual book itself. So the basic premise of the book Breath is that the author, James Nestor, he kind of performed like a self experiment in which he put silicone plugs into both nostrils so that he effectively plugged his nose nonstop for 10 days. I think that was like the experiment. And then that forced him to breathe through his mouth. And he basically, the experiment was, what will happen to me if I only mouth breathe for like 10 days? So, and then he reports on what happened. Our question for you is that like is that a scientific endeavor to do such a thing? Does that like help qualify this book as a science book or not? Like what's that about, to do an experiment on yourself?
So that is more like a journalistic. It's
Mm.
just to make a popular science book or whatever content book more interesting for people to read. So whenever you read, if you read things of this kind of genre that are written by journalists, they tend to be written in this way because it gives a narrative. Now, it's not to say that you can't write a popular science book without a personal
Hmm.
narrative that isn't interesting. There are a lot of people who do that, who are scientists. Even the one, actually, I'm thinking there's some scientists who add that in their books just to make it more relevant. So
Hmm.
um, it's not uncommon. It's a common technique to make it seem more interesting. And I guess in this case, because it's a journalist writing it, you'd see it in like a feature article, for example. Like they'd frequently write a feature article in the same way, like in any topic that has a personal narrative running through it. So
Hmm.
essentially, it kind of pulls together all the other stuff that is being discussed, like all the other people he spoke with or the research that he looked at in this personal narrative to make the thread of the
Right.
story and to make it more relatable and more interesting.
That
But in like
makes, yeah.
a scientific context, you might call that like a case study, which is like a very low form of evidence. But even a case study would be written by presumably a scientist or a practitioner, not written by the person who was the subject themselves. So
Yeah.
that's rife with the opportunity for bias.
Oh yeah, it isn't evidence. It's just there to tell you the story of how it felt for one person.
Right. And I wonder, Rachel, like what your opinion might be on this, but I sometimes the claimed negative effects of mouth breathing, some of them I feel like could be in the realm of those symptoms could be kind of subjective, like they could just be, they're not necessarily like objective, like we can measure these things. It's more like how you feel. I just wonder if you think that if someone has a bias already that mouth breathing is bad, which James Nestor clearly does, and then they go to plug their nose and only mouth breathe, I wonder if their bias or belief about what might happen could potentially influence how they might feel and then report about what they experience. Do you
Yeah, so
think?
that's the confirmation bias that I mentioned in the post that
Yes.
I wrote. So that's like a very
Yes.
common bias in this kind of thing. And I just wanted to say also, like, scientists have confirmation bias like 100%. Like, I remember
Yeah.
doing my PhD, and Travis, maybe you felt the same, where I was like willing the cells to do what I want them to do. Like saying no, but this is what's going to happen, and like when it didn't happen, trying to like try and be properly scientific and actually write down what happened. But scientists do this too. Scientists are human and they have the same kind of biases. It's just that there are checks and balances, and there's more people involved in the study, or like there's peer review, or people repeat it, etc., etc. But confirmation bias is basically when you want to see something happen, and like you look for the results that confirm what you want to happen. So in this case, and I have to say, like, I don't know enough about like nasal versus mouth breathing. Like most of the stuff I know is pro nasal breathing. But as you say, like it's possible like the effects or like the extent of the mouth breathing experience that he describes about like all of the symptoms that he felt and like how awful it was, it's possible that they could have been tainted by confirmation bias to like will the symptoms to happen, basically, because they are quite extreme. Like some of the physiological things that he reports are quite extreme.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And thank you for explaining too that confirmation bias. It's kind of just like maybe natural to the way our brains work. Like everybody, including scientists, can operate with this, but just that explaining that like the greater context of a scientific study, ideally checks and balances are built in there to like help kind of control for such things. But it's like a natural human thing to
Yeah,
be led around by our biases for sure. But then that's
exactly.
just potentially why a book like this, we might want to look at it critically when we see that it's being claimed as like a popular science book,
Yeah,
because
and
is that, yeah.
it's the same as like when building the narrative and selecting what evidence you're gonna present,
Right.
is selecting the evidence that's going to support the thesis and the narrative you want to give, right? So sometimes you
Mhm.
might just see like, oh yeah, there's something there, but I'm just going to ignore it and just like write about the things that confirm the narrative that I want to present.
Yes. That makes so much sense. I think maybe just like a final question that we might throw at you about this is so you mentioned confirmation bias, which I think is great for us and our audience to think about, and especially in terms of the author of the book and how he wrote the narrative. Do you think that confirmation bias could also be playing a role in the fact that the book is so popular in the yoga world specifically? Like, do you think?
Yeah, 100%. And I meant to check this because I feel like there might be another bias in there. But like, I can't think of what the name for it is. But basically, it is a thing where the whole narrative of the book is essentially aligned with a lot of the kind of yoga or complementary health. It's not just yoga, it's like qigong or tai chi or like other practices. Like it's all aligned with that, or like all the breathing world is like a whole other beast, and that's
Yes.
aligned with
Yeah.
that as well. So essentially, like it's like selecting the thing that's like telling you that what you're doing is great, keep doing it. But I was also thinking there's something around like it makes you feel good about what you're already doing. So there might be something
Yes.
in addition to it's not just
Yes. Yeah.
confirming what you're doing,
Oh,
but
what
it's
is
also
that?
making you feel better about what it is you're already doing. So you're like, oh great, I'm so amazing because I was already doing this, and like it's fantastic.
Wow. I love how you put that. And I mean, I know we all do that. Like we're not just trying to point a finger at this one,
Right.
this is just an example to try to highlight so that we can all learn to maybe be a little more aware and intentional and critical in our thinking. But it's so easy to be drawn to something that's already affirming the way what you already do and what you already like to
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
easy to
Like you
not be
say, we
critical.
all do it. It's
Mm.
human. It's human nature. We're always gonna, and that's what the whole thing about all the biases that exist is things that scientists or behavioral scientists have recorded about how people behave naturally and like what drives our behavior, and like confirmation bias is one of them. There's like a whole list of tons of them out there.
Yeah.
Right.
And in this particular book, there was no effort made to avoid that. Maybe
Right.
all effort was made to propagate that. Whereas if it were a scientific text, systematic review, there are you there are ways that you try to mitigate that with your search criteria and your vetting of
Mm-hmm.
the sources and all that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's like why we have science and why science is important is it's a system that attempts to try to minimize bias as much as possible because it's really
Exactly.
hard for us to do that otherwise.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think there was anything malicious or like intentional about it. It's just
Yes.
normal. Like he went out and wrote this book, and he collected the things that he thought were supporting his thinking. I think what happened after is probably more the problem. Like popular labeled as a popular science book, like no one actually thinking about checking all of these things. Like some of these references are pretty dubious. Like some of these studies were really dubious, like sample sizes of like 10 people or stuff like that, or like citing like BKS Iyengar as like a reference is not really a reference, or Wim Hof himself, like stuff like that. So it's just like thinking about like, okay, where do we want to place this? Is this holistic health, or is this more of like, or like a memoir type thing, or is this popular science? And I think that is the problem. And I just genuinely don't think it was anything malicious behind it. It's just like snowballed, and then because of confirmation bias, then everybody's like, oh my god, this is the best thing ever.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The author, probably didn't intentionally go out of his way to misrepresent. He just is a journalist and not a trained scientist or scientific communicator to be able to know that a sample size of 10 is not appropriate to make really definitive conclusions, and that you can't cite people's opinions as evidence
Yeah.
or strong evidence, at least.
Yeah.
That makes so much sense. And Rachel, thank you so much for expressing that, and Travis for affirming. No malice here. It's just like maybe it's just how it ended up, how the book kind of ended up coming out when in the style that it was written, and then like kind of what's happened after this kind of
Yeah.
snowballed since then. So we so appreciate your taking the time to join us and to share, both for the benefit of Travis and myself and for our whole audience and the yoga community in general, just sharing your excellent scientific communication skills and your insights with us. So thank you so much for being here. Oh, we will put links in the show notes so that everyone can find you. Your blog, would you like to tell really quickly your what's the website where people can find you and sign up for your email list?
So my website is geeky.yoga, and it's got my blog, and there's a link in there to sign up for the mailing list as well. It's a Substack with a similar kind of URL. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it is in there. And I
Yeah.
basically write posts around the science of yoga and various different topics, and a little bit about behavioral science. And the newsletter is more about well-being and recommendations of things to read or listen to that are relevant to well-being. Sorry, and also yoga studies. Like I look at every month, like what was published, and I write a
Right.
summary of those. Yeah.
I
Oh, what
love
a
your
valuable
newsletter.
resource.
It so is.
And I love the URL too. I think that resonated with Jenni and me
For sure.
immediately, because we often refer to our treatments as geeky movement type
Oh,
content. So
the best.
kindred
Mm-hmm.
spirits.
Yeah. So geeky.yoga is your website. Everyone should go there, check it out, and sign up for Rachel's email list. And we'll have the links to everything in the show notes. But thank you so much for being here with us today, Rachel.
Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to chat with you.